Hello, continuing a series here on encounters with the risen Christ as we move through this Easter season. I'm Pastor Paul here at St. Andrew, and today, even though we've had several devotions, I want to go back to the beginning of the Easter story, which is the stories of the empty tomb. And I guess to make a distinction here, that's usually what we hear Easter morning, and if you only come Easter morning, that's what you hear every time, the empty tomb. We aren't actually on to the encounters with the risen Christ yet. The empty tomb comes first, often what we hear and celebrate Easter morning, but then begin the encounters with Christ. Although it depends which gospel you read, whether maybe the encounters with the risen Christ are already beginning almost as soon as that news of the empty tomb has begun to spread. So for the devotion today, really we're looking at all four Gospels. And the first thing you'll notice is, as you read the four, probably more than even other parts of the Gospel story, the emphasis is very different in the four Gospels. And frankly, there's conflicting ideas as to maybe the order of things happening, certainly like who was present. So for example, some of them mention which women went. The list of the women who went to the tomb is different. And then you get to John, and it really only talks about Mary Magdalene. She's the one who's in all four. Some of the Gospels place more emphasis on their coming to prepare the body that they weren't able to finish on Friday. They're coming back to anoint his body. Again, John, the emphasis is she's just coming to weep. Which of course is part of it as well. Why do we go and prepare the body? It's part of our mourning. Speaking of mourning, spelled a different way, one will say it's still dark, and one will say it's more or less at daybreak, and they're a little bit different wordings. Matthew mentions the guards at the tomb. So lots of little things. And as you go through the day, again, there's this coming and going to the tomb, different people going and checking it out, back and forth, and then ending up in a room by themselves by the end of the day. So it's very chaotic. And on the one hand, that's always going to bother us to have these four accounts. I mean, on an intellectual level especially, and say, hey, why don't these line up? On the other hand, that is a chaos that seems very familiar to me. First-person accounts, witness. If you think of witnesses in a courtroom, they aren't going to have the same perspective on things, and they may not even line up in all their details. And that doesn't make them a witness that isn't credible. It's just a difference of perspective and so on. And they didn't all take sworn affidavits later that day. This is years later. These stories are collected and passed on as best they can be. But what I actually like about the stories and makes them very credible to me is the chaos. The coming and going. If you've had a day that's been disrupted, I'm afraid more often we get surprising bad news that turns a day upside down. We can relate to that. None of us have gotten this good of news to disrupt our day, but maybe it's something a good news. But you're in a bit of a haze, and you want to ask these disciples, well, did you run back and forth to the tomb all day, or did you stay locked up? And well, we kind of split the difference. Sometimes we couldn't help ourselves. We ran out there. Other times we were afraid. We were hiding. And all of these stories have these wonderful combinations of with fear and great joy. They ran from the tomb. Fear and great joy, while still disbelieving, they worshiped him. Phrases like that. Well, which is it? Well, we felt pretty afraid, and we also felt like rejoicing, so we just went on ahead and did both at the same time. That is a very true to life experience, I think. Again, that we can relate to. With this good of news, it is shocking, and it isn't something you can just fully incorporate and believe right away. And there's things that are just so shocking about it that we're going to be fearful in the midst of that, or disbelieving, or questioning. So that's part of the story. There is a lot of, Matthew and John both suggest that the women actually see Jesus maybe not too long after they've discovered the empty tomb and heard the words of the angel, or At least one gospel just says a young man in bright clothing. Luke, though, doesn't mention that. Luke says the women went to the disciples and told them what the angel had said. Matthew, it says, as they're going, they encounter Jesus. John has us following Mary Magdalene's perspective, and she hears the angel and almost immediately then encounters Jesus. So it could be that the resurrection encounters begin already at that point. Maybe it's later in the day. Each of them has a little bit differently, but I love there's just some real something very relatable in the chaos of that day, in the excitement and the wondering, and it's finally by the end of the day that the disciples start to gather and saying, I've had this experience, I have too, and then finally Jesus in the midst of them. So from the empty tomb to Easter evening, I don't know if we're ever going to get a timeline for how this plays out, and that's probably barking up the wrong tree to try to do that. But we get a sense for that day, the power of this gospel message to disrupt these lives, but in what turns out to be a very, very good way. So the empty tomb starts us off on this journey, looking for the risen Christ now loose in the world. Thanks.